Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Louis Falgout.
And I am your other host, Stephen Falgu. Get Recc'd is our occasional podcast that we have where I'll recommend something to Louis and Louis will recommend something to me. Although this is a little bit of a different episode, we're coming at you with a hot new bonus episode.
Yes, a bonus episode based on the release, the pretty much July 4th release of Hamilton to Disney Plus. It can now be streamed. You can watch the stage play in a much easier format from your home. Last time that we talked about Hamilton, Steven had recommended to me the cast soundtrack. I had seen Hamilton on stage, but it was a year or two, or maybe even more, before we actually talked about that stage recording. So we ended up focusing a lot more on the cast recording of it, and now we can actually discuss it like as a play because I was able to watch it. Steven was able to rewatch it. You had seen it, right? So you were able to rewatch it.
Yeah.
So both of us had seen it for like the second time or so. And it is a recording with the original cast, same as the cast recording.
Yeah, so we thought it would be good to just go back because we had talked so much about the soundtrack and hit on notes of the actual play itself, but we're not necessarily able to talk specifically about the features of the play. So in this bonus episode, we wanted to do just that. We probably will not talk so much about the music or the lyrics as we did last time, and more talk about the actual staging and performances. But just as the nature of this being a sung through musical, it's kind of hard to not talk about the music as well. So I'm sure we'll talk about some things that we've already talked about before, but we thought it would be interesting to take a look back. This is not a re-rec because this is literally the same thing. Although I will say the cast recording and this recording, or the soundtrack recording and this actual filmed recording are slightly different. You can tell it's a little later in the actual run of this original cast, so they're having a little bit more fun in the screen recording than in the very played through soundtrack recording. But for the most part, the actual music and lyrics and everything is exactly the same. It just comes down to talking about primarily the stage play.
Yeah, so I guess we'll just get into it. You know, in case you missed our last episode, essentially, I was not at all a fan of the soundtrack, although I did not hate it. Steven is a massive fan of the soundtrack and the play. So we kind of come into it from those perspectives. Though it is definitely watching it with the original cast and everything, which neither of us were able to do when we watched it live, can definitely, I think, shed a little bit of new light on it and show you a little bit, just show you a little bit of different things, you know. And I will say, like right off the top of everything here, that like the original cast is clearly the essential way to view this. I think that like all of them are just very good. They have great stage presence. A lot. I have seen people complain about like Lin Manuel Miranda. I have seen people complain about his voice and such, which I didn't find a problem when I listened to it. I still didn't find a problem here. I actually think that he has a lot of presence and decent range, even. Maybe his rapping is a little bit corny, but whose isn't? But, like, the performances from everybody, namely Daveed Diggs, who plays two different characters, one in the first act and one in the second, if you can call it two acts, I guess, just but before and after the intermission. Two separate characters. Eventually, Thomas Jefferson in the second act. I don't remember the name of the. Who's the guy in the first act who David plays?
Marquis de Lafayette.
Yes. So those two characters. And I think David is fantastic in this play. I think that the actor who plays Aaron Burr is fantastic. I mean, just in general, the Schuler sisters, all just really, really great.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I mean, they all have such a profound presence on stage. And as I mentioned, I do believe this was much later into the actual original cast runtime. In fact, I feel like, if I remember correctly, the filming of this performance is pretty much almost close to the end of their run on Hamilton. So you can tell they're having a lot of fun on stage and they really know those characters now in the way that they are riffing a little bit on the pre-existing lyrics and music, and as well as kind of like just their general swagger on stage. Every single one of them, you can tell one is having an absolute blast in this musical, and it was the biggest thing at the time, like just absolutely revolutionary, pardon the pun, because I mean everyone was trying to get their hands on a ticket to Hamilton, and you can tell they're still very humble. You can feel that on stage, but they have a really good presence and they really understand the performances that they're portraying.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, worth mentioning as well, like one of the strongest, if not to me, the strongest thing about Hamilton as a stage show is really the staging of the whole thing. So, for one thing, there's only one set, and it is a remarkable set in the sense that it doesn't matter what location they're supposed to be at, the set works. You always buy it. They can be in a bar and the set looks like a bar. They can be anywhere else they are in the course of this, like in an alleyway. And the way they changed it is by having people on stage come out and bring props out and other settings onto the stage while the set around them remains the same at all times. And just by moving props around, they're able to completely transform the set, which was something that I thought was really cool. I also think that the set was designed in such a way as to allow a lot of people to be on stage and a lot of different choreography, both above and below. Even like a stair ladder that gets rolled around on stage. There's just so many little things that made it really come alive, despite it never really changing.
Yeah, and the other thing to mention about that is it's not like big set pieces either. As you mentioned, it's just like a very static backdrop and then props. And I'll also mention that same humility is brought to the choreography, because honestly, there's not much choreography, like as far as actual dancing and what you would consider from a traditional musical. There is some, don't get me wrong, but there's no big showstopper choreography, nothing like that. The choreography truly boils down to like basically you have ensemble cast constantly moving props around and people having to be in exact positions to show one passages of time but two different locations. And that is really really interesting to me, because it almost feels like, and it's going to sound weird, but it almost feels like that hip hop uh, mindset brought to the stage, just like this super on the ground, in the streets performance on stage on every single performance. Now, there are some bigger numbers that do have more going on. Like the stage itself rotates in the center, it's a big circle in the center and it rotates. And there are some really cool things that they do with that, with the rotating stage, again, to show passages of time and those sorts of things that in certain in some of the tracks really highlight all the performers and those sorts of things. But for the most part, the actual choreography is very, very minimal.
It's also impressive because the actual show is nearly 3 hours long. It's like 2 hours and 45 or something around there. It's very long, and yet they managed to keep it alive and interesting the entire time. Like, I don't know that I would want to sit down and watch all of this, mainly because I'm not a huge fan of it necessarily. But like that being said, I do think that it keeps itself interesting. Like, I wouldn't say that this is like super boring, especially once again considering the fact that there's only one set. I think that on like every single level, the choreography and the staging is fantastic in the show. Also the costuming, and so really like on every fundamental level here, I think that it's super strong. You've got great actors, you've got great dancers, great choreography, but again, like Steven said, it is pretty subdued. I wouldn't say there's anything too spectacular going on here. It's not this huge spectacle, it's not this huge event. It's grounded, and having one set keeps it that way too. And it is impressive that they managed to get so much out of that one set. And if I had to pick a favorite thing about Hamilton, that is absolutely it. Like, all of the technical aspects of this play are phenomenal.
Yeah, and some of the specific numbers I wanted to call out are there. There are some really great There's some really great choreography in songs like Wait for It or Room Where It Happens, those sorts of things. But I feel like at best, when they're utilizing that center rotating stage, that's really where this thing shines. And that would be in Satisfied, where they're literally using the stage and the actors to showcase a reversal of time as like a flashback. And then the other one would be, and they're also using like a record scratch sort of a thing. So the turntable in the middle of the stage is literally representing a turntable and turning back time, which I think is actually pretty cool. And the other one, I can't think of Hurricane, where they're using that center rotating stage again to kind of showcase a violent storm this time, and then also ensemble actors with props are moving them around in such a way to simulate that hurricane, and then freeze framing at certain points. And those sorts of like they're not big show-stopping musical numbers. There's no big show-stopping stage pieces, but the performances and the choreography and the minimal stage that they have really carry those performances to that next level.
Yeah, so then you kind of get into talking about the actual story and the structure of the story. So, of course, Hamilton, and I have no spoiler tag, so fair warning. Again, this is history. I mean, well, at least most of it is. What are you going to do? But, of course, Hamilton is the story of American founding father Alexander Hamilton. It interweaves with other figures like Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr and George Washington and, those guys. And in the first half of the show, it is the Revolutionary War period, where you go through Alexander Hamilton's job throughout the Revolutionary War, which I forget exactly what he was. He was in some position under George Washington. Do you know what it is? I'm not
Yeah, it was called a aide de camp, I think is.
sure. And you see that a lot of their stories interweave throughout this section. Of course, this is where you meet all of the characters, but it really does focus a lot, I think, on this point in history, and I think Hamilton's role throughout it. And then in the second half of the show, it's not quite as specific to one event. It's really just everything after that. So Hamilton having written the Federalist Papers, Hamilton having established the National Bank, or fucking hell, something like that. And he was he was also the treasurer under George Washington's administration. You also see the John Adams. Well, you don't see the John Adams administration, but that happens. And then you have the Thomas Jefferson administration. And this part of the play focuses a lot more on Hamilton's personal life, political life a little bit, but mostly personal life. With the birth and death of his son, his relationship with the Schuler sister, and yeah, did I miss anything?
No, and then obviously the big scandal,
Oh,
Hamilton's
yes.
biggest scandal, and then also his very famous duel.
Yes. So this is what I'll say here, what I like and what I don't like. So I like the first half of Hamilton a lot. I actually think that it does a very good job keeping its course straight. Like, you're really able to just, like, it hammers in on this event in history and it just goes for it. And I think that the musical numbers are mostly stronger in this half, although, I mean, go back to the other episode. I don't really like them, but I like a few of them. The introduction and the use of the king in this half, I think, is more impressive, although he comes back in the second half and it's funny there too. I love those scenes, by the way, that stuff with the king, so good. And I think that in general, it feels like a very focused experience in this first half. I think that this is where a lot of the things that are special about this play really shine for me. And I don't feel like there were as many moments in this first half that bugged me, or I thought were kind of weird, or I thought were a little bit too off course, or I thought were confusing, or I thought were unnecessary, which there's a number of that in the second half. And I will stop there so you can talk about the first half too.
Yeah, for the most part, honestly, I definitely agree. The second half, while it does do some really smart things, I think it becomes a lot more nebulous, and I don't feel like all of the tracks are as strong as the first half. The first half is just so structured, so well structured, and honestly just a more interesting historical event to follow than the second half, which is much more political and also much more to do with Hamilton's personal life. But for the most part, the first half is just, there's a lot to like there, I think, from choreography to, as I mentioned, story events and structure. The second half does have its merits, though. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. I want to talk about the some overarching structure things, which I think are really smart, and I'm sure we talked about them before, but I wanted to bring them up again now that you can actually see the physical embodiment of those things. But specifically, what I'll talk about in the first half is just the actual American Revolutionary War and its portrayal, because it's not necessarily, again, it's like a stage portrayal of the Revolutionary War. So it's not necessarily people on stage fighting, but there's really great choreographed allusions to the battles and the way that a lot of the tracks hit harder than the second half. And I mean that from lyrical quality to performances from David Diggs and others. You definitely feel the grit and the griminess of war. And I think that that plays very well on the actual performances from all these casts too. The one that I specifically want to call out is Christopher Jackson as George Washington. Is just, he has such a commanding presence, and it is just such a perfect casting for that character.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. And I also think that the portrayals of Hamilton and Washington's relationship during this time is also one of the more compelling things throughout the play for me. I think there are certain scenes with them two in this bit that are just very strong. In general, actually, I'd say character chemistry is really good from the beginning to the end of this first half. And the fact that it focuses pretty much solely on the American side of the war and doesn't really show you battles necessarily allows a lot of the dialogue. Of course, it's like an opera, so I guess it's sung, but it allows a lot of that to stand out more, and it allows you to get used to the character of Hamilton and the people that he's meeting and the other founding fathers and other war figures in just a very compelling way. Like, in general, I think that the first half is really strong, and something I do want to call out about it as well is that in the music, there's a really good use of reprise and no, it's not reprise. What's the musical term I'm thinking for? The thing in a score where you use a theme and you have it recur throughout other songs. I don't remember it right now. I'm sorry. I must have just failed all of my music classes ever. But anyway, it's something. Maybe it'll come to me later. But they do have a great reuse of melodies and themes and sections of songs and choruses from other songs that translate into songs later. That I think is just so good in this first half. It allows itself to feel almost self-contained, and it even has a strong finish too.
Yeah, especially, I mean, all of that that you just mentioned absolutely comes to a climax in Nonstop, which is the last song of this first half, which is right after the war, Hamilton writing the Federalist Papers, defending the Constitution. All of these little individual events are kind of building up to a post-war America. And at the same time, pretty much every track that preceded it is interwoven into this final song, with each of the different cast of characters utilizing the lyrics that they've sung before in either the same way or different ways to highlight that resolution of the first half, which I think is just incredible. A Nonstop is, if not my favorite song, absolutely one of my favorite songs on the entire soundtrack.
Yeah, so then we get into the second half of this play after the intermission, and this is where things falter a lot more for me. Um, and there's a few reasons for that, but just story wise, one of the things that bothers me about this section is that it has not. I almost said no, and then my brain stopped itself. It has almost no focus. There is a through line in the sense that we're following Hamilton. We're looking at the early years of the country and some of the early presidencies, and some of the political through lines are kind of there, but things really jump around a lot. You have the rivalry between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson politically is shown a lot. It kind of comes in and comes out throughout the play. The eventual rivalry between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr comes into play. And it kind of shows up and goes away throughout this section. And then you have Hamilton's personal failings, like him cheating on his wife, and you have that sort of shows up and goes away, and it does interweave with the other stories. It's not like it's super jumbled. It's just that I don't feel like there's nearly as much of a through line as there was in the first half. When things end, it's like, yeah, they end with his death and whatever, and his son's death. Like, those things do wrap it up, but like the final song, you're just like, okay, that's it. And it's like, oh, all right. That's kind of how it felt to me, which is not to say that it's not climactic. It is a little bit, but it just does not feel like the perfectly structured, I shouldn't say, well, perfectly structured, but very well structured first half. And to me, it's just much, much, much less impressive.
Yeah, from a structure standpoint, I definitely agree. I think that on the whole, the second half does have merits, and there are a lot of really good tracks here, and some of the storylines are interesting historical events. And I kind of disagree with the end. I actually do think that the ending of this thing is really powerful, as you get into like Your Obedient Servant, which is a super fun track, which is like a diss track between Hamilton and Burr, going into Best of Wives and Best of Women, and then culminating with The World Was Wide Enough, which is an interesting introspective take on Burr looking at his life from a different lens, at counter to Hamilton, which there are a lot of little interesting like tidbits that you can take from this thing. I think the more I listen to it, the more I watch it, there are a lot of really cool things that you can pick out. Like there's just a thematic. This is not necessarily something I don't think anyone wouldn't pick out on their first listen or their first watch, but thematically, Hamilton literally throws away his shot at the very end, whereas Burr, who had thrown away his shot so many times before, who has been Hamilton, who was never reserved, who was always Spitfire, and this is true in history too, and Burr, who was so reserved always, whether that's true in history or not. The culmination of that final scene where Hamilton throws away his shot and Burr does not. I think that all of that is really interesting. And then finally, that the play doesn't end there, which it absolutely could have, because honestly, the play begins with Burr talking about how he shot Hamilton. But the play ends actually with Eliza, who goes through so much in the second act specifically, actually telling Hamilton's legacy, and each of the different individual players as well, talking about how Hamilton's legacy reflected on them. Hamilton is not necessarily, or at least before this, was not necessarily the most talked about founding father. He had import, absolutely, but not to the level of some of the others that are in this story. So I think that that's an interesting take on a way to kind of reflect and close this thing. And then there's a lot of talk about what that very, very final scene is, where Eliza just kind of like looks up to the audience and gasps. Those sorts of things I think are actually kind of interesting. But for the most part, I 100% agree with you. The second act, the structure of the second act just definitely feels more like, it feels more like Lynn actually just writing the Hamill rap, which this thing originally was before it was a play, which was just like, you know, a series of raps and lyrics based on Hamilton's life. The second act feels much more like that than the first act does.
Yeah, so in regards to the ending, something that really bothered me about the ending was that at the very end of the film, they have a bit in the final song where they talk about how it is a shame that that people don't talk about Hamilton because he did all these cool things. The problem is that the play does honestly a pretty bad job of getting me to understand why I should care about Hamilton. And let me explain what I mean by that, because obviously it did get a lot of people to think about it more. But when you really think about it, what is this film? Well, I guess it's a film on Disney Plus, but what does this play actually teach you about Hamilton? Like, it kind of goes through a bunch of tidbits of history and things that he was, kind of. Like, we know his positions in certain administrations. We know his position in the war. We get a very, very vague idea of what he did politically during this time. But because of the second half of the play, it is so torn between, do we want to, talk about Hamilton as a personal figure? Do we want to talk about him as a political figure? Do we want to do both? And it never really decides which one it wants to do. You end up not really having any idea of what you're supposed to be learning from it. And I understand that it's a play and it's not a history lesson, although it definitely is framed in such a way where you are kind of supposed to learn history from it. I think it does a really poor job of actually teaching you anything, and it certainly does a poor job of getting a central theme through. Like, there are so many different lenses with which to analyze the founding fathers, and some definitely more valid than others. And you get the impression that this play wants to do a different take on them. It wants to mythologize the founding fathers for a new generation of Americans and also different kinds of Americans, casting the vast majority of the cast and all the founding fathers as people of color, and of various different ethnicities and racial categories. It's like there was a very strong attempt there to say something, but I don't think the play actually ended up doing it. Instead, the play kind of just glosses over a lot of things, and that's not even just like the worst elements of all of these founding fathers, which it definitely does gloss over those things for sure. It barely brings them up at all. It mentions that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, I believe, at one point, and there are a couple times where it tries to have like a pro-immigrant message, although even that gets kind of muddled because it only comes up at certain points where you're just kind of like, okay. And then by the end of the play, it almost tries to frame itself as like, well, see, this was supposed to make Hamilton, supposed to make people talk about Hamilton now, who was a really important figure. But honestly, no, the play didn't really do that either. It kind of just hopped around from theme to theme without really sticking to one thing. But ultimately, I was going to say that I even feel like it glosses over just general history points. Like, everything just kind of happens. I think that this play is structured and framed much, much more like the life story of Hamilton. So you learn about his personal life. So you learn about him as a character, and makes him a bit more of a relatable figure to younger audiences as compared to the other founding fathers, some of whom are framed kind of like douchebags, particularly Thomas Jefferson. Although, once again, even with that idea in mind, I'm still left kind of confused as to what I'm supposed to get out of it, because I saw somebody say, like, was the point of this play to tell me that cheating was wrong? Which maybe. That's certainly a gigantic theme in this part in the second half of the play, where that becomes a big element. And I just wonder, like, I guess it's good they didn't gloss over it, but at the same time I wonder, how is this supposed to be something that shows me why I should care more about Alexander Hamilton? That's my thing, is that I feel like this play wants to frame itself as that, but I don't see how any aspect of this play actually accomplishes that goal.
Well, I agree. I would also say that this play, like in contrast, this play definitely has merit in that it energized an entire generation of people to care about history. And that might be enough, honestly, because again, I 100% agree. Like, if you're going to watch this play to actually learn about Hamilton, you're probably not going to learn anything that you don't already know, because Hamilton's most important, or should I say, most impactful historical moments are the Reynolds pamphlet, the Federalist Papers, and the National Bank. Other than that, and all of those things are covered, you're not really learning anything new or understanding him any differently. But because of the way that it's all presented, and to be fair, it's like not even historically accurate. Like, a lot of it is not even necessarily true. But even still, I think as an art form and as a medium, it created a whole generation of people who actually now care enough about history to research a lot of the things that I feel like, even as you mentioned, were glossed over. And what, to its credit, I will say this, although I do agree that it definitely glazes over a lot of the worst parts of history, I think Lynn was very smart and very cognizant of the fact that, those things, it's hard to bring those things to the stage in this format, because he did write a lot of that and it just didn't make it there. But he's not in the way that he frames a lot of the founding fathers, and not all of, because even Hamilton, honestly, is not necessarily glorified in this because he did do terrible things, and some of those terrible things are shown in this play. Obviously, not all of them, and not all of them for any of the founding fathers, but he didn't. It's still more progressive, I feel like, than anything that is even still taught in schools as to who these founding fathers are, because as an American culture, we put them on such a pedestal. What I would be interested to know, and I have no idea how we would ever find this out, but I'm curious how this plays for a non-American audience, because it was just as big for non-American audiences. And I would be curious, one, did this play get non-American audiences more interested in American history and the research that goes into American history? And two, how does this, as a piece of art and even historical context, just straight play for those who aren't familiar with the background? Because we can say that we didn't learn anything from this, but that does not mean that no one learned anything from this. And I would also say that that's also true for, again, the younger generation. I know that Lynn won casting all the people of color. That was very much a strategic standpoint when he created this. One, just because he wanted to cast his friends. Two, it's not easy for them to get these roles, obviously. But three, it really energized a different audience of children to actually care about history, art history, musical history, actual American history, those sorts of things. I know that there was one of the very final performances of Hamilton was actually somewhere around the final performances of Hamilton was actually at the White House for Obama and the Obama administration. And as a part of that, and this is something that he did very, very often, he invited grade school kids to come and see the play and to see their performance for free. And he often did that when they were in New York as the full cast, because it did energize those kids to care about and actually research a lot of these topics. So, with all that being said, I agree with you. If you especially are an American and come into this, you're probably not going to learn anything new. But I would say structurally, this has energized learning. And I think that in and of itself is a powerful statement.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree that it's pretty cool, I guess, and I think it is tricky to say exactly what should have been done differently if this play had to happen. I mean, you could always just say it shouldn't have happened at all, but maybe that's kind of short-sighted. Maybe. I guess my only concern with it is that when we talk about like energizing people to learn history, there are different lenses that you can frame history through, right? So obviously, like, I think that going forward, we need to be more critical of our country and its past. We need to be a lot more critical of our country and its past. It doesn't mean that we can't ever discuss things that were good or that were done well, of which there have been many, even in this period. And those are things that should be discussed. But the thing about like something like Hamilton and I will agree it's more progressive than like history books in a lot of the ways that we learned about founding fathers before, but including that stuff though as well, I think they all fall into this trapping, is that I do think that it continues to mythologize these figures. You don't have to glorify them. You don't have to say like, look how great these people are, which I agree this play does not do. To its credit, it doesn't do that. Despite the fact that it glosses over the worst aspects, I still don't think that people are glorified. They're not villainized either, though. Not that they need to be, but it's somewhere in the middle. But it still does kind of mythologize them. Like, it makes them all very relatable. It makes them all, in some cases, it makes them virtuous. I think that Hamilton is very much treated like a virtuous figure throughout this play, even though we do see the worst things that he does. But, you know, how many stories have like a hero character who we look at as a great person who does something wrong in the course of the story? You know, it's very common. And I guess it is just kind of like, when we talk about getting people to be interested in history, I think that is great and people should learn. However, when you start them down a path of learning history through the lens that I think Hamilton and history that's preceded it, of seeing these figures as these really important, I mean, they were important, but really kind of amazing figures, not necessarily amazing people, but definitely amazing figures who did incredible things. When you have only that lens and you are kind of selective about the worst things that you show, I don't know that it really advances history learning in a great direction. So that would be my main complaint. I don't think, as much as some people do, that this play is heinous, because some people definitely think that it is. And when you compare it to other historical fictions that have come before it in regards to the Founding Fathers, I do think that it does a better job. But I guess I still think that if there is to be another popular work about the Founding Fathers, I would hope that for the first time we can really see something that paints it through an actually genuinely critical lens. In the same way that through a positive lens, you can show some of the more negative aspects still in there, with a critical lens, you could still show some of the more positive aspects too. But you can suggest, look, these positive aspects absolutely happened, but, you know, Thomas Jefferson also, like, raped underage slaves and all the worst things like that as well. You know, and I don't think that these things have to be pulled apart all the time. But, you know, with all that said, I do admire, to some extent anyway, Hamilton's attempt to reinvigorate a new generation for these topics, as other works about the Founding Fathers have done, you know, in the past as well. And I think it's iffy. I think it's a bit of a mixed thing for me, was how I would say it. But yeah.
Well, I want to talk about one more thing before we wrap it up, and that's some of the smaller little takeaways that I don't think you can, well, I know you can't get out of just listening to the soundtrack. So some of those things are very specific to actually being able to see the stage play. First, before I talk about that, I want to talk about some of the things that you can get out of the soundtrack. And I'm pretty sure we talked about these before, but just thematically, I think it is, you know, I know for sure we talked about last time how I actually find it's really fun that the cabinet battles are like rap duels and those sorts of things. But I want to talk about this time specifically, and we might have talked about it before again, the use of a very small cast playing characters that have some functional relevance between the two acts. So you mentioned David Diggs plays Marquis de Lafayette, who was a French marquis who helped fight in the American Revolutionary War, basically an aristocrat and a military officer that helped train a lot of the American troops. Marquis de Lafayette goes back to France in the first act, at the end of the first act, and in the beginning of the second act, the first thing that you see is Thomas Jefferson coming from France to America, and David Diggs is playing both of those characters. And there's little things like that. Hercules Mulligan, I can't think of the actor's name, but he's also plays James Madison. There's a lot of switches like that I think are really interesting uses of the cast of characters, and also kind of have like story significance for why those people we would be portraying those two characters. The other thing I wanted to talk about was some of the smaller things. I think I did mention this one last time, and I tried looking out for it in this specific Disney Plus taping, Lewis, and I don't know if you saw it or not, but essentially Mariah Reynolds, who is the woman that Hamilton has an affair with, after the affair happens, she is just always in the scene somewhere. She's either up on the balcony, she's in the shadows. It's like she's this piece of Hamilton's mind that's constantly like in his thoughts and literally on the stage. And I think what's the coolest moment is when he decides to take quill to pen to write out the Reynolds pamphlet, which was honestly this wild and exorbitant, extravagantly written, super flourished take of him having an affair, so that way his own political standing could be still held in esteem. Mariah Reynolds is the one who actually hands him the pen from behind. The other one that I mentioned that I've seen a lot of people talking about lately is one of the ensemble cast performers. She dies very early on, and then from then on actually becomes like an embodiment of death. Like she will whisper in people's ears or tap them on the shoulder, and then they will die in that scene or in the following scene, and culminating in her actually being the representation of the bullet going from Burr's gun to Hamilton. Those little things are, I think, really very well thought out. I definitely credit the producer and the choreographer on some of those things because those are just little tiny touches. And every time I watch this, I pick up on little things like that that I think are pretty cool.
Yeah, and I guess one of the final things we might want to talk about, since I think the way a lot of people are going to be seeing this now is from the filmed version. I do want to say, in regards to that, the one you find on Disney Plus, that you do kind of lose something watching this through a camera lens. There are like background details and background choreography that gets missed because of the camera. Sometimes it focuses in on a central character in a way, obviously, if you were seeing it on stage, it wouldn't do. And I do think that in general, they keep it really engaging and really captivating, but there are things you're going to miss watching it that way. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. I wonder if there was a way it could have been shot so that you didn't miss anything, but I acknowledge it might be a little bit less visually interesting watching it at home. So what can you do about that, I guess?
Yeah, I guess I do just want to quickly talk about, though, even with that aside, I do like how dynamic this filming is because it could have,
Yeah.
and it would not have been, but it could have easily just been a flat static camera filming the entirety of the stage. But they add a lot of they add a lot more dynamic elements to actually create a lot of energy that you wouldn't get in the musical. So that's kind of like a pro and con, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I tried to mention it, but maybe I wasn't clear enough. Yeah, no, I agree. Actually, watching it as a film uh, on your television screen or whatever, it is actually pretty great. It does capture a lot of energy, and it captures your interest too. I think in a way that watching it on stage would as well. And I don't think that like a static camera would have done that. So I can acknowledge that. But yeah, there are pros and cons to it, and I guess it's just something to be wary of. Um, Lastly, I say lastly, but I don't want to wrap it up if you're not ready to. So forget the lastly, maybe. But I do want to say, though, in regards to the music, because this was my biggest, obviously, the thing that I was criticizing the most when we first talked about Hamilton, and I would be equally critical if I just heard the soundtrack. I do believe that when you watch it with the actual actors performing it and with the choreography, it's definitely better. Um, it's still very corny, but it's not nearly as corny watching it than when you're listening to it. And I do think that some of the corniest moments, like the rap battles, come across a lot better when you're watching them than when you're listening, because when you're watching them, the actors do play it up. I think they do play up the fact that some of it's kind of campy, or I shouldn't say campy, but kind of corny, and kind of silly even. And I think they do a decent job allowing you to take it seriously. Whereas when I was listening to this, I just couldn't. But with that said, I still don't think the music's grown in me necessarily. I mean, I still would have the same complaints. I feel like the actual hip hop sections don't feel totally authentic, and they're oftentimes very corny. The lyrics are, the wordplay's okay sometimes and really not so okay other times. The music, the instrumentals, and the beats range wildly in quality from some really great stuff in some of the more Broadway-esque numbers versus some pretty terrible stuff when it turns into synthetic beats. I think it's all over the place, but I will say it does definitely redeem itself in the full play. And obviously, that's all you can ask for, considering the cast recording is just a cast recording. It's not the full experience. And I think as a full experience, it's definitely better. So that's what I'll say about that.
Yeah, and I'll just add on a point that you mentioned before with the king, and then a point you just kind of mentioned here as well. There's a lot of really fun visual gags. Yeah, as I mentioned at the top, like you can definitely tell the cast is having a lot of fun with this now, and there's just a lot of physical comedy that is really, really funny, and especially with the king specifically. And in the second half, I think the king really just hams it up entirely. And all of that is really great. And that's something that you don't get on the soundtrack, obviously.
Also, in this performance, that is actually the recording that you can watch on Disney Plus. I don't know if this happened in every stage show, but during "I'll Be Back," I think it was, he's just got drool and spit just coming out of his mouth. I'm sure you noticed that.
Yeah.
And it was hilarious. The fact that he has so much dedication that he obviously didn't intend for that to happen, but the fact that it happened and he just let it happen and continued his posture, it made it even better. So props to him.
Christoph.
Yeah. And is
Uh,
that we want to wrap it up or no?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll go first since maybe this could technically still be seen as a rec to me, since that's what it started out as. And yeah, as I concluded, I think that it's definitely better than listening to the cast recording. I like it more. I do like it overall. I understand that I was critical. I am critical. I'm still not crazy about it. Even forgetting the more like problematic aspects of it, um, you know, in terms of the history and that sort of thing. Even tossing that aside, there are aspects to this play in the second act, particularly, or the second half, I should say, that don't really impress me. And there are parts that are worse than others. And there are some certain sequences I didn't even mention that I just did not like at all, but I don't want to go over them now. But essentially, it's a bit of a mixed bag for me because of that second half. But the first half is really, really cool, and the second half still has its moments for sure. Like, I don't want to write it off entirely. I think that Hamilton is pretty cool overall. I couldn't see myself watching it again, but yeah, it's better than I made it out to be when I was talking about the cast soundtrack, so there is that. And I guess if I had to score it, I would probably give it on the whole a 6, because half of it is probably like a 5. But if I did have to score like the first half, it's probably more like an 8. Or if I was really feeling generous, a 9, but I'm not going to go that far because I don't like the music too much. But yeah, I just want to make it clear that I do think the first half of Hamilton is pretty awesome. Yeah, that's my take. Do I recommend it? I mean, you can watch it on Disney Plus if you feel like it. I wouldn't personally recommend it to anybody, but it is obviously a big cultural event, and if you haven't seen it, there is an easier way to see it now, assuming you have Disney Plus. So go for it, I suppose.
And I don't think that I really have a different opinion of this thing necessarily. I still really enjoy it. I enjoyed being able to see it on Disney Plus as a film performance. It doesn't hold a candle to the live stage performance. I think that if you have the opportunity, you absolutely should go see this live on stage. It is just incredible. And although you don't get the original cast, who are really phenomenal, most of the traveling casts are really great as well. In fact, Lewis, did you know that Aaron Burr was played by Wayne Brady at one point?
I did not know that, no.
Yeah, in Chicago, Wayne Brady played Aaron Burr for a little bit. It's just a really, I feel like on the whole, although it does have its problems, it's a very energizing play. I really enjoy what they've done with it. I don't think we'll ever see anything like it again, honestly. I think it was kind of a one and done thing. And I feel like, honestly, the musical genre is just going to go back to its standard performances and its standard mindset, which is sort of a shame because I do think that there's a lot of room for growth and a lot of room for creativity. And I feel like Lin-Manuel had a vision and he was able to perform on that vision, and it became a sensation unlike anything the musicals had seen for quite a long time, and probably for quite a long time still. I don't remember what I scored it, but whatever I scored it, I would give it the same, and I still recommend it.
I think it was like a 9 for the record, but anyone can go back to that episode and watch. Actually, I would encourage you to. I think we both would encourage you to go back and watch that. And since you've seen this bonus episode, you've seen our new take, see what we thought then. Actually, I'd be curious to watch it again, even. Listen to it again. Sorry. It's a podcast, whatever. But yeah, that pretty much does it. We want to thank you for supporting the show, as always. And of course, this episode, although it was not streamed, it'll be up on CastBox as well if you're not already listening to it there. And we will see you in, the next streamed episode. Do you have anything to say, Stephen, before we dip out?
Nope, that's it.
Well, with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations, sort of. Get wrecked.